Spring, 1945. The Third Reich is crumbling. Across Europe, the guns thunder less frequently, but the suffering is everywhere. Fields are scarred by shell fire, towns lie in ruins, and in makeshift hospitals across Germany, young women in white armbands work with trembling hands and dwindling supplies. They are German nurses, some volunteers, others drafted, trying to keep shattered bodies alive with little more than rags, morphine diluted beyond meaning, and faith. Then, something remarkable happens. As the Allies push deeper into Germany, entire German medical units, doctors, orderlies, and nurses are captured. They brace themselves for the worst. Propaganda had warned them of brutal treatment at the hands of the enemy. They expect humiliation, perhaps even violence. Instead, they are led into a world that feels impossible. They step into American field hospitals. Their eyes widen, clean operating rooms gleam under electric light, shelves overflow with bandages, antibiotics, and blood plasma. Wounded soldiers are treated with dignity, regardless of nationality. Even German prisoners of war lie in neat beds, their wounds carefully dressed, their pain managed. For many German nurses, this is the moment their world collapses. Everything they thought they knew about their enemy and about their own nation's superiority is shaken. One German nurse later recalled in her diary, "Dopes, we had been working with nothing, tearing bedsheets into strips, reusing bandages, sometimes with dried blood still on them. When I saw the Americans change dressings twice a day, with fresh supplies each time, I could hardly breathe." Sumps. This is the story of war not told through tanks or generals, but through bandages, syringes, and human hands. A story of how abundance met scarcity, and how compassion collided with propaganda. And it begins with a question: what happens when the enemy heals you better than your own country ever could? In their shock lay not just disbelief, but a revelation about the very nature of war. To understand the shock those captured German nurses felt, we must step back into the collapsing heart of the Reich in 1944 and 1945. Germany had once prided itself on medical science. Before the war, German universities led in fields like chemistry, pharmaceuticals, and surgery. Yet, by the last years of the war, that reputation was only a ghost. Years of Allied bombing had left hospitals in ruins. Supply lines had crumbled under relentless air raids. Medicine that once flowed in abundance now trickled to the front in pitiful quantities, if at all. For the young women serving as nurses in the Wehrmacht and the Red Cross, daily life was a battle not against the enemy, but against hunger, disease, and despair. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Surgeons operated with blunt instruments. Blood transfusions were rare, sometimes impossible. The wonder drug, penicillin, was nearly non-existent in German hospitals, a guarded treasure that only a few elite units ever saw. Meanwhile, propaganda painted the enemy as cruel, barbaric, and wasteful. German nurses were told that American and British soldiers were weak, dependent on machines and luxuries, while Germans endured with strength and sacrifice. But reality told another story. The US Army Medical Corps was perhaps the most advanced medical force in the world. By 1945, American hospitals had mobile X-ray units, refrigeration for blood plasma, antibiotics in supply, and surgical techniques refined by years of hard fighting. More astonishingly, they treated enemy wounded with near the same care as their own men, a policy rooted in the Geneva Convention, but also in an American philosophy that saving lives was a moral duty beyond uniforms. So when German nurses, who had spent months or years in scarcity, sometimes feeding starving patients broth made from potato peels, stepped into American care facilities, it was not just a shock, it was a revelation. One American medic remembered the look on their faces, the thought we were magicians. They watched us open fresh packages of gauze, change bandages every morning, and they whispered among themselves as if it was sorcery. But this contrast was not just about medicine, it was about ideology. For the Reich had promised its people superiority, yet it could not even keep its healers supplied with soap and cotton. The Americans, painted as decadent and weak, instead showed strength through compassion and resources. For the captured German nurses, This was not just the collapse of a war, it was the collapse of a worldview. And soon they would face the moment where their loyalty to the Reich and their sense of humanity would be tested. What they saw next would forever change their memory of the war. They were not soldiers, not by choice. Many of the nurses of the Wehrmacht and the German Red Cross were barely out of their teenage years. Some had joined out of patriotic duty, others because the Reich had called them. Some simply wanted to help, to save lives, to ease pain. But the war they walked into was not the noble service they imagined. Take Ilse, a young nurse from Bremen. In her diary she described her first weeks near the front. I thought I would be passing instruments to doctors in clean rooms with proper medicine. Instead, I wiped dirt from wounds with rags and prayed infection would not kill them before the bullets did. Or Ilse, drafted in 1943, who recalled the desperation of late-war hospitals, the furrying 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 of holding a man Sepp's hand as he died because we had no morphine left. I told him it would be quick. It was not. These nurses lived in two worlds. By day they were angels of mercy, racing between bedsides, trying to keep men alive in overcrowded barns and basements. By night they were vulnerable young women, often cold, hungry, and terrified of air raids or advancing enemy troops. Propaganda told them they were heroes, servants of the fatherland. But in truth, many felt abandoned, carrying burdens their government could no longer shoulder. When capture finally came, often in the chaos of retreat, sometimes in surrender of entire medical units, their emotions were a storm. Fear of abuse, fear of being shot, fear of never seeing home again. But also relief. Relief that the endless flow of blood might stop. Relief that they might not have to watch another man die for lack of a bandage. An American soldier who guarded one such group wrote home, "They looked like frightened girls, not enemies. Some of them still wore blood on their aprons. They clutched their bags like schoolchildren on their first day, but inside were only scraps, old scissors, used gauze, tiny bottles half empty. That was their whole hospital." These women were about to witness something that would leave them speechless. The enemy's hospitals overflowing with supplies, humming with electricity, doctors working with speed and confidence. For them, it would be like stepping from a world of shadows into a world of light. They had lived at the edge of despair. Now they were about to discover abundance. But abundance, too, carries its own kind of pain, for it shows you what you never had. The moment of capture was not the end of struggle. It was the beginning of a new one. When German nurses were escorted into American hospitals, they entered a place that felt almost unreal. Clean, white sheets, bright lamps, shelves stacked with morphine, sulfur drugs, and penicillin vials. The smell of disinfectant instead of blood and rot. They had been warned. The enemy would treat them cruelly, perhaps starve them, perhaps worse. But instead, they saw something else entirely. American medics treating not just their own wounded, but German prisoners of war with startling care. One nurse later confessed, "Sage, it was unbearable, almost more than the war itself. To see the enemy tending our soldiers better than we ever could, it was like being stripped naked. Everything we had believed collapsed." Say. But admiration was mixed with anguish. Every fresh bandage handed out by an American medic reminded them of the men they had lost for lack of one. Every syringe of morphine sparked memories of soldiers who had died screaming under their care because none was available. The conflict now was not between armies, it was within their hearts. Some resisted the feelings of awe. They whispered bitterly that the Americans were wasteful, that Germany's shortages were only temporary. They clung to the remnants of loyalty to the Reich. Others broke down quietly. They wept when they saw blood transfusions performed with ease, remembering the faces of boys who had bled to death in their arms. One American officer described the scene third. They stood at the edge of the ward like statues. Some covered their mouths in shock when they saw us discard used bandages. For them, that was unthinkable. To throw away cloth that could be washed and reused. It was like throwing away life itself. Lancet. And yet, a new kind of suspicion crept in. The German nurses wondered, was this care only for show? Would they be treated the same if they fell ill? Was this abundance genuine, or propaganda of its own? The clash between what they had been taught and what they now saw with their own eyes tore at them. For years they had been told the Reich was strong, the enemy decadent. Now standing in those white gleaming wards, they felt a different truth pressing against them. It is one thing to fight an enemy with tanks and rifles. It is another to face the silent battlefield of the mind, where loyalty, belief, and truth collide. For these young women, the war was no longer outside the walls. It was inside them. The shock turned into torment. For the captured German nurses, the gleaming American wards were not simply impressive, they were unbearable. Everywhere they looked, they saw reminders of what they had lacked. Fresh linen, when they had wrapped wounds in filthy scraps. Ampoules of morphine, when their soldiers had writhed in agony without relief. Penicillin, the miracle drug Germany had never mastered in scale, sitting in bottles as if it were endless. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "I could not breathe. I thought of the boy who had begged me not to let him die in pain. I had lied to him, said he would sleep soon. But he screamed until the end, and here they injected morphine into prisoners, even into our men, as if it was nothing. I wanted to scream myself." The breaking point came not in violence, but in compassion. The nurses watched as American doctors carefully stitched wounds of German prisoners. They watched as captured enemy soldiers were fed, bathed, and placed in clean beds. Some of these very men had once fought against the Allies, yet here they were treated with dignity. For the German nurses, it was like standing in two worlds at once, the brutal scarcity of their past and the abundance of their captors. Some collapsed into tears, unable to reconcile what they saw. Others withdrew in silence, refusing food or comfort, ashamed to admit how deeply shaken they were. An American medic remembered one nurse whispering to him, "Footy, why do you treat us like this? Why waste so much on those who tried to kill you?" He could only answer with a shrug. Because it is right. This was the crisis, not just of supply, not just of war, but of identity. For years they had believed they belonged to a nation destined to rule, a people stronger and more disciplined than any other. Yet here, in the final days of the war, they saw with their own eyes the simple, devastating truth: their Reich had promised everything and delivered nothing. And worse, it had let its own sons die in agony while the so-called enemy saved them. There are many ways a war can be lost: by tanks, by planes, by hunger. But for these young nurses, the war ended in a different way, with the shattering of belief, the collapse of pride, the unbearable knowledge that mercy had come not from their leaders, but from their captors. This was their breaking point. But in the ruins of despair came something unexpected. From the ashes of despair came a shift. The captured German nurses had entered the American hospitals expecting cruelty, humiliation, perhaps neglect. Instead, they found themselves fed, sheltered, and allowed, even encouraged, to assist in patient care. At first, suspicion clouded their every step. They asked themselves, was this kindness genuine, or was it theatre for their eyes? But as days turned into weeks, the truth became undeniable. The Americans treated the wounded, any wounded, with consistency, discipline, and mercy. One German nurse remembered her shock when she was asked to help with a transfusion for an American soldier. "I thought they would never trust me. She wrote. "But they placed the needle in my hand. In that moment I realized they saw me not as an enemy, but as a nurse." This was the turning point, when fear and shame slowly gave way to recognition. For some, it was almost unbearable relief. To step out of scarcity and into abundance was like being lifted from drowning waters. They could finally do the work they had been trained to do, not with scraps and lies, but with real tools, real medicine, real healing. Others clung to bitterness, refusing to let go of old loyalties. They muttered that America had won only because of its factories, its endless machines, its wealth. But even these voices grew quieter as the undeniable truth surrounded them each day. And then came the moral awakening. A nurse named Hildegard later reflected, "I realized then that war was not only about who was stronger, but about who cared more for life itself. We had been taught to glorify death for the fatherland. Here I saw men fight for every breath, for every pulse, no matter whose heart it was. It changed me. For many, this realization marked the first crack of light in the darkness of defeat. They began to see the Americans not only as conquerors, but as human beings, flawed, but guided by a principle that transcended uniforms. In that moment, the enemy became something more dangerous than a foe. They became a mirror, and in that mirror, the German nurses saw what their nation had failed to be. This turning point was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of a new struggle to reconcile mercy with defeat, and to understand how to carry these revelations into the ruins of their homeland. The American Army Medical Corps was not just a machine of healing, it was an institution of order. Everything had its place, everything had its purpose, and into this finely tuned system, the captured German nurses were carefully woven. The process began with simple observation. At first, the German women were asked only to watch, to see how American nurses and medics conducted rounds, changed dressings, administered drugs. They stood silently at the edge of the wards, eyes darting to each syringe, each fresh packet of gauze opened with ease. Then, gradually, they were given tasks, fetching supplies, recording patient notes, cleaning and preparing instruments. Their hands, long used to improvising with scraps, now handled gleaming surgical steel and endless rolls of fresh cotton. An American nurse later recalled, "They were hesitant at first. Their movements slow, almost afraid. But once we placed tools in their hands, instinct took over. They were nurses, after all. They knew how to heal, even if they had been starved of the means to do it. Sit." Trust was not given lightly. Guards remained. The German nurses were still prisoners, but something unexpected happened as days passed. Professional respect began to cross the lines of uniforms. American doctors recognized the skill of their German counterparts, the way they could suture wounds quickly, calm a patient with a whisper, or improvise when even American supplies faltered. The Germans, in turn, were stunned by the sheer abundance of resources and the efficiency with which the Americans distributed them. This integration was not without tension. Some German nurses balked at following orders from younger American women. Some American personnel resented seeing their enemy work beside them. Yet necessity outweighed pride. There were too many wounded, too much work to be done. And so, step by step, the lines blurred. One German nurse wrote later, said, "We had been enemies in the morning. By night we stood side by side over the same patient, handing each other instruments without words." The Americans also saw strategic value. Healthy, skilled nurses reduced the strain on their own medical staff. The Germans could treat their own prisoners, freeing American hands for their soldiers. It was a practical arrangement, but one that carried profound human consequences. This was not victory in the traditional sense. It was not won with rifles or tanks. It was won in silence, in small acts of cooperation, in the simple decision to heal together rather than let suffering win. And yet, in that cooperation, the German nurses could not escape the truth. Their captors had not only defeated their army, they had surpassed them in mercy. The execution of this system brought order to chaos, but it also brought the German nurses face to face with a question they could no longer ignore. What did it mean to serve a nation that had abandoned them when their enemy had given them the chance to truly heal? The moment of reversal came not in battle, but in a hospital tent. A young German soldier, barely 18, was carried in on a stretcher. He was pale, trembling, his chest rising only in shallow gasps. His comrades had whispered that he would not live long. In a German hospital, he would have been given little more than comfort in his final hours. But here, in the hands of the Americans, everything was different. Doctors shouted for plasma. Nurses prepared morphine and sulfur. Within minutes, tubes were inserted, wounds cleaned, bleeding stopped. The tent filled with a sense of urgent purpose, not to let him die, but to fight for his life. The German nurses stood rooted to the ground, unable to look away. Some wept openly. One covered her mouth as she saw the boy's side's face relax with relief under the steady drip of morphine. Another whispered, "Fida, if only we had had this." And then something extraordinary happened. An American doctor turned, saw one of the German nurses frozen in place, and simply said, "Phil, help me." Without thinking, she stepped forward. She steadied the boy's arm, passed instruments, held his pulse. In that moment she was not German, not enemy, not prisoner. She was simply a nurse, doing the work she had always longed to do. When the operation ended, the boy still lived. His breath was steadier. His color returned. The German nurse stood back, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Cedar, we would have let him die." This was the climax, the breaking of walls, the shattering of illusions. For years, the Reich had promised its people greatness, superiority, destiny. Yet it could not even give its sons a chance to live. The enemy they had been taught to hate had not only the power to save life, but the will to do it, even for those who had fought against them. In that tent, victory and defeat were no longer measured by maps or armies. They were measured by bandages, syringes, and breath. And in that measure, the Reich was exposed for what it truly was, a power that glorified death, defeated by an enemy who fought for life. This was their reversal, the moment the war ended not only in battlefields, but in their very hearts. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the captured German nurses were released back into a homeland that barely existed. The Reich was gone. Cities were flattened. Hunger and despair stretched across the land. They returned not as heroines, not even as veterans, but as silent witnesses. They had seen what few others had, the enemy's mercy, the abundance of supplies, the dignity given to the wounded, even those in enemy uniforms. For some, this was a burden too heavy to share. Many remained silent for decades, unwilling to admit how deeply they had been shaken. To speak of American kindness, in the ruins of German pride, was almost a betrayal. Their diaries, hidden away, would tell the story long before their voices ever could. But others quietly carried the memory, as a seed of change. A nurse named Margarete later told her children, "See, he learned that war does not belong to nations. It belongs to suffering people, and the ones who chose to heal, they were the true victors." Back in their homeland, the struggle was far from over. Medicine was still scarce. Hunger was still rampant. The proud Reich that had promised so much left nothing but ruins and orphans. And yet, for those who had seen American hospitals, the memory of abundance lingered like a ghost. Every time they dressed a wound with rags in post-war Germany, they remembered the fresh gauze the Americans discarded without thought. Every time they lost a patient to infection, they remembered the vials of penicillin, glimmering like treasures in Allied hands. But with the memory also came a strange kind of hope. They knew such a world existed, a world where medicine was not rationed like gold, where compassion was given freely, even to the defeated. And for some, this vision became a quiet rebellion against the despair of post-war life. An American doctor who later visited Germany in 1946 recalled meeting one of the nurses he had worked with during her captivity. She told him simply, "Ide, you showed me how to be a nurse again. Not for the Reich, not for glory, but for life." The aftermath was not written in parades or victory speeches. It was written in the quiet resolve of women who had seen mercy in the enemy Sepp's hands, and who carried that lesson into the ruins of their homeland. For them, the war never truly ended. It lived on, in the bandages they could not throw away, in the morphine they did not have, in the memory of a hospital tent, where the enemy saved lives their own nation could not. In the chaos of war, we often look to the clash of armies, the thunder of tanks, the roar of planes. But sometimes, history reveals its deepest truths in quieter places, in the silence of a hospital ward, in the gaze of a nurse holding a patient's hand. The story of the captured German nurses is not one of battles won or lost, but of illusions shattered. They had lived through scarcity so profound it blurred the line between healing and helplessness. They had watched men die for lack of a bandage, a dose of morphine, a vial of penicillin, and then in the enemy's hands they discovered abundance beyond imagination, and mercy given even to those branded as enemies. It was a reversal more profound than any military defeat. It was the collapse of a belief that had fueled a nation, the idea of German superiority, For these women, the truth was undeniable. Their Reich had abandoned them. Their enemy had healed them. The legacy of this moment lies not in humiliation, but in revelation. It shows us that war is not only about destruction, it is also about the choices made in its shadows. The choice to heal when others choose to hate. The choice to preserve life, even when the uniform on the bed belongs to the enemy. And in that choice, the Americans showed a power greater than weapons. They showed the power of humanity. History remembers generals and leaders, but perhaps it should remember too the nurses who wept in American wards because they saw at last what true healing could be. This story is not only about the past, it is a lesson for us now that mercy can be stronger than hate, that compassion can outlast ideology, and that the true victory in war may be found not in conquest, but in care. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Join us as we uncover the human side of war, the courage, the sacrifice, and the lessons that still speak to us today.